In Tanzania, what began as a tense election year has rapidly unfolded into one of the most significant political crises the country has seen in over a decade. As the nation prepared for the 2025 general elections, signs of strain between the government and opposition had been visible for months. In April 2025, the National Electoral Commission announced that the main opposition party, Chama cha Demokrasia na Maendeleo, widely known as Chadema, had failed to sign the mandatory electoral code of conduct required for participation in the polls. The commission stated that without the signature, the party could not be recognized as a legitimate participant in the upcoming general elections scheduled for October. The decision immediately drew public criticism and concern from civil society groups. For many Tanzanians, the exclusion of Chadema, one of the country's largest and most organized opposition movements, raised questions about the integrity of the electoral process. Opposition supporters described it as a clear attempt to weaken democracy by removing the only real challenger to the long-ruling Chama cha Mapinduzi, or CCM, which has governed the nation since independence. Tundu Lissu, Chadema's leader and one of Tanzania's most vocal opposition figures, condemned the Electoral Commission's decision, calling it unconstitutional and politically motivated. Lissu argued that the code of conduct was being used as a weapon to disqualify opponents rather than as a tool to ensure fair campaigning. His public remarks quickly drew the attention of authorities. Within days, he was arrested and charged with treason, an offense that carries a potential death sentence under Tanzanian law. His arrest triggered outrage among human rights organizations, who described it as another example of the shrinking democratic space in the country. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and several regional watchdogs issued statements warning that Tanzania was at risk of reversing decades of progress toward democratic governance. They documented a rise in politically motivated arrests, restrictions on public assembly, and increasing control over the press. Reports of harassment and intimidation of opposition members had become frequent. Local journalists described a climate of fear, where critical reporting on government activities could result in suspension, detention, or the revocation of media licenses. Several independent online news outlets were shut down for what authorities called publishing content that incites public disorder. In the months leading up to the election, multiple opposition rallies were blocked or dispersed by police. Organizers were routinely denied permits, and gatherings were often labeled as security threats. Meanwhile, the ruling CCM party continued its nationwide campaign without visible restrictions, reinforcing perceptions of a heavily tilted playing field. As the October elections approached, public frustration deepened. Political analysts in Dar es Salaam, Arusha, and Mwanza began warning that the situation could deteriorate if the government continued its hardline approach. Many citizens voiced fears that the coming vote would not only lack fairness but might trigger unrest. On October 28th, just a day before the polls opened, social media activity in Tanzania began to slow down. Users across multiple platforms, including WhatsApp, X, formerly Twitter, and Facebook, reported delays in sending messages or accessing live content. By evening, digital rights groups noticed signs of a partial internet restriction, a move that has become increasingly common during politically sensitive periods in parts of Africa. By dawn, on October 29th, polling stations opened across the country. Voters were expected to cast ballots for the presidency, parliament, and local government offices. Officially, authorities called the process peaceful and orderly. But eyewitness accounts from Dar es Salaam and other urban centers painted a different picture. Turnout appeared low in major cities, with many polling stations seeing only a fraction of expected voters. Some citizens said they stayed away out of fear of violence or because they believed the results were already predetermined. Others told local reporters that the absence of key opposition parties rendered the process meaningless. By mid-morning, as ballots were being cast, tensions began to surface in Dar es Salaam. Small groups of protesters gathered near several polling centers, demanding transparency and calling for the release of detained opposition members. The chants quickly grew louder, spreading from the central business district toward the city's outskirts. Eyewitnesses reported groups of mostly young people carrying placards and shouting, "We want our country back." As crowds swelled, some protesters began blocking roads and lighting tires on fire. Videos posted online, though difficult to verify due to intermittent connectivity, appeared to show thick smoke rising near the city's port area. In one district, a police station was reportedly set ablaze during the clashes. Security forces responded swiftly, deploying tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse the crowds. Military vehicles were later seen patrolling major intersections, a rare sight in Dar es Salaam's normally calm streets. Authorities described the protesters as violent rioters and vowed to restore order. But opposition supporters argued that the demonstrations were largely peaceful until police intervened. The conflicting narratives made it difficult to determine the scale and nature of the unrest. By early afternoon, the situation had worsened. The internet blackout deepened, cutting off mobile data services nationwide. Messaging platforms, news websites, and even banking applications went offline, isolating citizens from real-time information. Digital rights advocates described it as a deliberate move to suppress coverage of the unfolding chaos. As evening approached, the Tanzanian government announced an immediate curfew in Dar es Salaam. Beginning at 6 p.m., residents were ordered to remain indoors. Security forces patrolled neighborhoods through the night, while smoke from earlier clashes lingered over the city. State media outlets downplayed the unrest, describing the protests as minor disturbances contained by security forces. However, eyewitness accounts told a different story, of widespread tension, blocked roads, and fear spreading among ordinary residents. Meanwhile, international observers expressed concern about the credibility of the elections. The European Union and several African Union officials noted irregularities in the process, including the exclusion of opposition candidates and restricted access to polling stations. Independent election monitors said their operations were hindered by the internet shutdown and travel limitations imposed by authorities. In smaller towns, reports began to emerge of isolated violence and voter intimidation. Some polling agents from lesser-known opposition parties claimed they were denied entry to counting centers. Others reported that ballot boxes were removed under heavy security escort before tallies could be verified. By late night, unofficial reports circulated online suggesting that turnout figures in key urban areas were drastically lower than expected. Analysts estimated that less than 40% of eligible voters in Dar es Salaam participated in the polls. In contrast, rural strongholds of the ruling party recorded high participation rates, further fueling suspicions of manipulation. As midnight approached, tension gripped the capital. The combination of uncertainty, restricted communication, and visible military presence created an atmosphere of anxiety. Families stayed indoors, lights dimmed, listening to radio updates were available. Some described hearing sporadic gunfire in the distance, though these accounts could not be independently confirmed. On the morning of October 30th, Dar es Salaam woke to silence. Streets that would normally be bustling with traffic and vendors were largely deserted. The curfew remained in effect, and security checkpoints were established at major intersections. Reports from the Port District indicated that the area surrounding the burned police station had been cordoned off, with debris still visible from the previous night's clashes. Government officials urged calm and praised security agencies for what they called swift action against lawbreakers. But opposition supporters and human rights groups described the situation as a crackdown on political expression. Across social media, once access was briefly restored, hashtags like Tanzania Election 2025 and Free Lissu began trending regionally. Activists from neighboring Kenya and Uganda voiced solidarity with Tanzanians calling for transparency. International news networks began covering the story, describing the events as one of the most significant democratic setbacks in East Africa in recent years. Diplomats from the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom released coordinated statements urging restraint, respect for human rights, and the restoration of internet connectivity. At the same time, Tanzanian authorities defended their actions, insisting that the internet disruption was a temporary security measure aimed at preventing the spread of misinformation. Government spokespersons stated that the situation was under control and that the election results would be released as planned. Yet, for many citizens, the sense of control had already been lost. Businesses remained closed, schools suspended classes, and public transportation routes were limited due to blocked roads. The uncertainty over what would happen next overshadowed the country's political future. The ruling CCM party maintained confidence that it would secure another decisive victory. But the absence of genuine competition meant that few viewed the outcome as a reflection of the people's will. Instead, the election became a symbol of frustration and resistance, a moment that revealed deep divisions within Tanzanian society. By the end of Election Day, at least 2 confirmed deaths had been reported, 1 civilian and 1 police officer, as a result of clashes in Dar es Salaam. Human rights monitors warned that the number could be higher given the difficulty of verifying reports under the communication blackout. As darkness fell again on October 29th, Tanzania stood on edge. The country had voted, but the outcome was already in doubt, not because of ballots counted, but because of voices silenced. The following morning would bring an even wider wave of unrest, spreading beyond Dar es Salaam and into other regions, marking the start of a national crisis that few could ignore. The morning after Tanzania's general elections brought not relief, but shock and uncertainty. On October 30th, 2025, the atmosphere across the country was tense and subdued. In Dar es Salaam, streets that had been scenes of confrontation only hours earlier were now quiet under heavy security patrol. Armored vehicles remained stationed at key intersections, and checkpoints were set up along the main roads leading out of the city. Police and soldiers in full riot gear were visible outside government buildings and media offices. The government's curfew, first declared the previous night, remained in effect. Residents were ordered to stay indoors as authorities claimed they were working to restore peace and prevent further violence. Despite the silence, the scars of the previous day were evident. Burned debris and shattered glass littered parts of the Port District, where protesters had set fire to a police station. In several neighborhoods, black smoke stains marked the walls of nearby shops. The fear among residents was palpable, not only fear of more violence, but of what the country's future might hold. By mid-morning, reports began emerging from other regions across the country. In Arusha, Mwanza, Mbeya, and even in smaller border towns near Kenya and Zambia, sporadic protests had erupted. Demonstrators blocked roads with stones, logs, and burning tires, echoing the anger that had spread from the capital. Witnesses described young people chanting anti-government slogans and waving homemade signs demanding free elections. In some areas, small groups clashed with security forces. The military established roadblocks on major highways, inspecting vehicles, and questioning travelers. At the Namanga border crossing between Kenya and Tanzania, transport came to a halt as protesters set up barricades and police attempted to disperse them. By late afternoon, several key roads leading into Dar es Salaam were effectively closed, cutting off movement between the capital and surrounding towns. Local media struggled to report these developments. Many journalists were unable to access the internet or contact sources due to the continued digital blackout. Some television stations resorted to replaying official statements from government ministers, while independent broadcasters faced increased scrutiny. A few reporters managed to post brief updates once intermittent connectivity returned. Their accounts painted a grim picture, a nation gripped by fear, confusion, and anger. Human rights groups working on the ground confirmed at least 2 fatalities from the previous day, 1 civilian protester and 1 police officer. However, they cautioned that the real toll could be higher, with several people still missing and hospitals reporting injuries consistent with rubber bullets and tear gas exposure. The government dismissed claims of excessive force, insisting that officers had acted professionally to protect public order. Officials characterized the unrest as isolated incidents instigated by criminal elements seeking to disrupt democracy. In a televised address, the Minister of Internal Affairs praised security forces for their bravery in defending the nation against chaos. He accused opposition supporters of spreading misinformation and warned that anyone found participating in unlawful gatherings would face arrest. Meanwhile, opposition figures, speaking through limited online channels and foreign-based networks, accused the government of orchestrating a campaign of repression. Chadema representatives demanded the immediate release of detained protesters and renewed calls for Tundu Lissu's freedom. Outside Tanzania, reactions were swift. The African Union expressed concern over the reports of violence and urged dialogue between political actors. The United Nations Human Rights Office called on authorities to respect freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. Western governments, including the United States and the United Kingdom, released coordinated statements emphasizing the need for transparency in the vote counting process and accountability for any abuses committed during the unrest. But inside the country, communication remained strained. Many Tanzanians still had limited access to information. The nationwide internet disruption, now entering its 2nd day, continued to affect everything from media coverage to online banking and small business operations. Analysts noted that such digital shutdowns often have long-term economic consequences, eroding public trust and discouraging investment. As the crisis deepened, attention turned back to the political roots of the unrest. For decades, Tanzania's ruling party, Chama cha Mapinduzi, or CCM, has dominated national politics. Emerging from the independence struggle of the 1960s, the party built a legacy of stability and unity under founding leader Julius Nyerere. But in recent years, critics have accused CCM of consolidating too much power, stifling dissent, and eroding democratic institutions. The 2025 election, many observers argued, exposed these underlying tensions more clearly than ever before. The exclusion of Chadema and other opposition voices meant that voters were left with limited options. For many citizens, the polls no longer represented a genuine democratic exercise, but rather a ritual reaffirming the ruling party's dominance. Political analysts described the unrest as a symptom of deeper frustration, not just with the election process, but with systemic issues such as youth unemployment, corruption, and economic inequality. Tanzania's young population, which makes up the majority of the country, has grown increasingly disillusioned with politics. Many see little opportunity for change through conventional means. When the protests began on election day, they were fueled not only by anger over political exclusion, but also by years of pent-up resentment. The heavy-handed response by security forces, combined with the internet blackout, intensified those emotions. In interviews conducted after the unrest, several citizens expressed a sense of betrayal. "We have no voice," one resident of Dar es Salaam said. "Every time we speak, they silence us. Every time we vote, they choose for us." Human rights experts noted that such sentiments reflect a broader crisis of trust in governance. The combination of limited civic space, restricted media, and one-party dominance has created an environment where political participation feels meaningless for many. By late October 30th, the government moved to reassert control. Hundreds of people were reportedly arrested nationwide, including activists, journalists, and suspected protesters. Police confirmed that curfews would remain in place until further notice. State-run television carried images of calm streets and reopened shops, suggesting that order had been restored. But independent observers disputed that narrative, citing reports of ongoing detentions and isolated clashes in several regions. International attention continued to grow. The East African community announced plans to send a fact-finding delegation, while foreign embassies urged their citizens in Tanzania to avoid large gatherings. Within the country, the National Electoral Commission proceeded with its schedule. Preliminary results began to emerge, showing the ruling CCM party leading by a wide margin. Opposition parties, where allowed to compete, rejected the outcome, calling it fraudulent. In Dar es Salaam, where many polling centers had seen low turnout, the announcement of CCM's overwhelming victory was met with skepticism. Citizens interviewed by local outlets said they no longer believed their votes mattered. Economic activity remained sluggish as businesses operated under restricted hours. The tourism sector, a major contributor to Tanzania's economy, reported cancellations from international visitors citing safety concerns. The Tanzanian shilling experienced minor volatility in regional markets as investor confidence wavered. By early November, calm gradually returned to the streets, but the sense of normalcy was fragile. The curfew was lifted in stages, and internet access was slowly restored, though social media platforms remained partially restricted. As the country resumed daily life, discussions turned to accountability and reform. Human rights organizations called for an independent investigation into the violence, including the conduct of security forces and the circumstances surrounding civilian deaths. The government, however, signaled no such intention. Officials maintained that all actions taken were within the bounds of national law and necessary for maintaining order. The Ministry of Information issued a statement accusing foreign interests of attempting to destabilize the country through misinformation campaigns. Analysts said the response underscored a broader regional pattern, one where governments under pressure framed dissent as a threat to national stability, rather than a symptom of democratic decline. Despite official assurances, trust in public institutions remained low. The opposition continued to operate under restrictions, with several of its members still facing legal charges. Tundu Lissu, still in custody, became a rallying symbol for those demanding political change. In the months following the unrest, Tanzania faced mounting scrutiny from international partners. Aid organizations and trade bodies called for the protection of civil liberties as a condition for continued cooperation. But the government, buoyed by its control of domestic institutions, appeared determined to press on. What happened in October 2025 left a deep mark on Tanzania's political landscape. It revealed the fragility of the country's democratic processes and the limits of public dissent under an entrenched ruling system. Experts say that the unrest also exposed a generational divide. Younger Tanzanians, many of whom were born after the country's transition to multi-party politics, increasingly view the political establishment as disconnected from their realities. For them, unemployment, inflation, and corruption remain more pressing than party loyalty or ideology. The government's challenge moving forward lies not only in restoring order but in rebuilding legitimacy. Without meaningful dialogue or reform, analysts warn the cycle of discontent could repeat in future elections. By the end of 2025, Tanzania had regained a semblance of stability, but the underlying issues remained unresolved. Independent media continued to face restrictions, opposition leaders operated under close surveillance, and civil society organizations reported ongoing intimidation. International attention gradually faded as global focus shifted elsewhere. But within Tanzania, the memory of October's unrest lingered. Citizens remembered the sound of tear gas, the silence of blocked networks, and the feeling that their voices had been muted. In retrospect, many describe the events as a turning point, a moment when the promise of democracy clashed directly with the realities of power. Whether Tanzania emerges from that conflict stronger or more divided remains to be seen. For now, the country stands at a delicate balance between peace and tension, between the appearance of democracy and the demand for its substance. And as history has often shown, such moments, though quiet on the surface, are rarely the end of the story.